we've seen some instances where exceptionally bad behavior has resulted in people being kicked out of their community. Anybody recall hearing about a lady named Rose Jordison? Anybody?
I think so.
Okay, we got one. By the time you guys leave, you'll know all about Rose. She and her son loved to breach bylaws of a Strata corporation, make noise, cause nuisance, interfere with use and enjoyment, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the Supreme Court of British Columbia ordered her to vacate, and her unit was sold. That's a very extreme example of what happens when a warning letter doesn't work. If you look at the wording of 135, you can see the process, though, of what has to be done, and it has to be, I'll use the term meticulous observance with section 135, because if you don't observe it properly, and it gets in front of a CRT adjudicator, they're going to pick away at the flaws in your enforcement process.
Yeah, I think we're way better at this as an industry. If you had 8 years ago, 10 years ago, we didn't follow that at all. We would just have a complaint from an owner, email council would say, yep, fine them. We'd send out a fine letter for $50. That was the end of it. And so now we're following that more diligent process where someone's submitting a complaint, we're getting it in writing, we're then taking the items to the Strata Council saying, yes, please let them know that they have a chance to respond. We're sending out a letter, giving them the details, giving them a proper chance to respond, and then they can request a hearing, they can meet with council, and then after all of that, if they either don't respond or if they do respond and council still wants to, a fine is levied. But it's a much longer, drawn-out process. However, it is more fair to that person because there is those situations where there's mistaken identity or, noise in a concrete tower. You think it's right above you and it turns out it's 3 floors over and two units down. And so it's really important that we are following this, and I think as an industry in general, we are much better than we used to be.
So, again, without boring you about all the legislative details, again, section 135 is the place to start and the place to finish when it comes to making sure you've taken the right steps, kind of pre-decision making. So you advise them of the complaint, giving them the particulars, as Sean has said, and then you go through the process of making a decision, whether they've come forward or not. They've given you something in writing. It's great if they have, because I think it makes the council's job easier. If they haven't responded, then you're making a decision, kind of a de facto decision in absentia, and I think there'll be a bit more scrutiny by the CRT should that happen. But once you've gone through the process, then you can make your decision, then you can impose your fines, as Sean has said. So this slide kind of details, in a summary way, what the process is for bylaw enforcement. And as you see, enforcement isn't simply there's a complaint and it seems to jive with our bylaw, whether it's a pet bylaw, a noise bylaw, or what have you. There is an investigative component to bylaw enforcement, and I've seen some CRT decisions where they've actually used that terminology, that there's a duty to investigate. And one of the worst requirements when it comes to investigating, obviously, is a noise complaint. A lot of others are easy to investigate. There's a no rental bylaw, and you know that there's a tenant because they actually tell somebody that they're a tenant, or you've got a VRBO, or you've got a pet and it's a no pet building. But when it comes to nuisance or noise, a bit more of a problem. But again, keep in mind that the investigation is exceptionally important. And again, when I'm papering my file, I want to be able to show the CRT that they have this. There has been investigation before decision making. One thing about 135 that's referenced here in the process is section 34.1. How many of you here as council members have had to sit in on hearings about bylaw complaints? Okay, a handful. Owners can make that request. It's in the Act. It used to be in the bylaws and it was ignored, but now it's in the Act, and people use it on a pretty frequent basis. And more importantly, people owners, tenants, residents in a building cannot actually proceed with a CRT complaint until they have requested a hearing and there has been a hearing held. So if you end up with a CRT complaint that somehow slipped through the cracks, it'll probably get kicked back or get kicked out until such time as a hearing takes place. Yes.
So maybe we want to elaborate on what a hearing is. So a hearing is really a chance for the alleged offender to address counsel, and there's time restrictions placed on it. And so, you know, the easiest thing to do for someone to respond in writing. However, it is harder because if you only have council meetings every 2 months and someone requests a hearing, you're going to have a hearing meeting in between your council meetings. And it's really just a time for that person to provide their input on how they see things. When it's for very minor violations, I saw it was one for $10. I was like, oh, all these council members got to get together and listen to this guy over a $10 fine. You know, if that's painful, but when you're doing a $200 fine, it's definitely probably worth it for that person to have a hearing and trying to address counsel. Any tidbits on hearings?
Just a couple of things. I generally tell my clients as council members that it's a hearing. It's not a discussion. It's not an opportunity to debate. You listen. If you have clarifying questions, if somebody says it happened on such and such a date and you know that date is wrong, you can say, don't you mean this date or what have you. Otherwise, it's just information gathering, but it's a one-way flow of communication. You listen, you hear what they're having to say, and then you make your decision.
Yeah.
I think that's important. Where you get into the debate, and I've seen this a couple of times, is where you get into trouble.
Yeah. Interesting enough, in our Ontario office, and if you look at Florida, BC and Alberta, and a little bit of pocket of Chicago are different in that we have portfolio. So a strata manager looks after more than a couple buildings. In Ontario, one strata corporation, they're not called strata corporations, bear with me, they would have the strata manager in the building, right? And so they'd have one strata manager per building. In Florida, it's very common where you'd have one person, California, Nevada. So there's in BC and Alberta, and a little bit of pocket of Chicago, we're different, and then a strata manager has to look after more buildings. Then you look at the number of fines that are levied in those other places, and they're drastically, they're way smaller. And the reason is that if someone has a late night noise complaint, that strata manager, if they're on site or if they have staff on site, is going up and addressing the issue right there and then. If there's a problem with smoking odor, the strata manager is going into the unit and checking it out there because they have the time to do it. In our market, it's a little different because the strata manager is stretched, council is also volunteers, and so there really is missing that investigative component. And so the more time and energy we can put into that, the more we can build that community and not have to just issue fines without doing a real thorough investigation.